My name is Sarah Mansour. I'm a research assistant at the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics. This is part of a series of interviews for this network called the Transatlantic Trade Videos. We're here today with Andreas, who is a professor of international politics at the Department of Political Science and Sociology at the University of Salzburg in Austria. Welcome, Professor Duo, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Hello, welcome to you.
So we'll get right into our first question. Do you think that trade agreements, particularly transatlantic ones, have a tendency to become politicized?
Yeah, let's first talk about what politicization in this context even means. So there are basically two conditions that need to be given for us to call a trade negotiation politicized. The first one is that there has to be a considerable amount of public attention to the trade negotiation. So public meaning among the broader citizenship. And the second condition is that there has to be a degree of contestation of this agreement. So there has to be opposition to the agreement. And if we apply this definition of politicization, we actually see that very few trade agreements do become politicized. So in a project that I'm doing, we are putting together data on trade agreements that have been signed since 1945, and we have a list of about 900 trade agreements, and my estimate would be that only about 100 of those, so just about more than 10%, could in any way be classified as politicized. There are two types of such agreements that we see that get politicized. On the one hand, we see politicization of trade agreements between large trading entities like the United States and the European Union and smaller trading countries. And we see the politicization in the smaller partner countries. So, for example, the United States-Korea agreement that was signed in 2007, it was highly politicized, but not in the United States, in Korea, where there were large protests against that agreement back then. And then we see agreements like the planned Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, that got politicized in several European countries. And the one thing that these negotiations, these agreements that do become politicized have in common is that there is a large economic large economic gains and losses at stake in these negotiations. So when the European Union signs a trade agreement with, let's say, Jordan, or the United States signs a trade agreement with Chile, there's hardly any real expectation of this having a major economic effect on the United States or the European Union. And so, of course, we see very little politicization of most of these trade agreements. Talking now about the transatlantic trade agreements specifically, I already mentioned this planned TTIP. There was politicization, not least because the stakes were quite high on both sides. So these are two big trading entities, lots of trade taking place, and there is the potential for major consequences of these agreements for people on the two sides. If we extend now the purview to look at also the EU-Canada trade agreement, CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, it also became slightly politicized, at least in Europe. And you may now say, yeah, that's a bit awkward given what you just told me, that there have to be huge economic stakes, because there for the European Union, really that was a minor agreement. And here it happens to be just a coincidence that TTIP created was highly politicized, and just in parallel we saw these negotiations for this trade agreement with Canada, and this was a kind of contagious effect that we saw here. The politicization of TTIP spilled over into CETA. But normally, if that hadn't been the case, I would have expected the CETA negotiations to be hardly noticed by the public at all. So, to answer your question, most trade agreements are not politicized, and many transatlantic trade agreements would not be politicized. So EU-Mexico, for example, is not. EU-US is a very particular case because of the high stakes in this case.
Okay, so in your opinion, How do global value chains, as well as the recent pushback against globalization, contribute to the politicization of transatlantic trade deals?
Yeah, these are two very important trends in terms of trade policy, but they actually have opposite effects on the politicization of trade agreements. So when we talk about global value chains, we talk about the fact that increasingly production processes are being spread out across several countries. Now, the effect that this has for the politicization is actually that we should see a decrease in politicization. Why? Because the stronger global value chains, the fewer losers you should have from trade agreements. So in a global value chain, you become dependent on imports, you become dependent on exports, so there are more winners and fewer losers. So imports are no longer seen something from which you lose. It is not an import competition that you experience, but it's actually positive for you because you need these imports in order to produce the finished good. So these global value chains, they should actually reduce politicization. Now again, you might say, yes, in that sense, why then TTIP? Why did we see this politicization in this case? Because of course, global value chains are very important in the transatlantic economic sphere. Now, I think that this is exactly one of the reasons why we saw the politicization not in terms of labor unions mobilizing and import competing industries mobilizing, workers mobilizing, but we actually saw quite well-off people that are quite well-off, that are highly educated, mobilizing over something that I would call like a kind of postmodern trade agenda, because they were more concerned about the chlorine chicken, the food that we would be eating in Europe, rather than the actual economic consequences of that agreement. And the second concept that you used in your question, this pushback against the globalization, the anti-globalization backlash, that's actually something that, of course, should increase the politicization of trade negotiations. So here we talk about, in many respects, about the real losers from trade, like the China shock would be a term that would be used in that context. So there are indeed, over the past, we have always known that there are distributional consequences to trade and to trade agreements. So there are winners and there are losers. And especially with the rise of China, the losers it has become more obvious that there are strong losers, especially the lower educated people in Western countries that are losing in terms of stagnating or even declining wages and job losses. And that clearly, so the more there is this sentiment of losses from trade agreements, the more you should see a politicization, the more you should see opposition to trade. And that influenced the debate, but mainly on the American side. So that's on this wake of a globalization backlash. President Trump was elected into office in 2016. So not all of his voters, of course, are globalization losers, but it was a small but important minority of his electorate in the Midwestern countries, Midwestern states. And they brought him into power in 2016. So that is indeed, that has consequences, and it should increase the politicization of trade policy. And it's interesting because these two developments, global value chains and anti-globalization pushback, they should actually push into different directions in terms of the politicization of trade.
Okay, and in what ways do interest groups attempt to influence public opinion, and to what extent does this explain the politicization of trade agreements?
Yeah, so when I talked beforehand about the economic stakes that a country has to have in a certain trade negotiation for there to be a politicization, I would understand this as a kind of necessary condition for the politicization. But a necessary condition by itself, it's not sufficient. No, there may be, this is at least, the basis is set for a politicization, but it's not necessarily that we then also see it. And the difference now between there are the preconditions and we actually see a politicization, that difference is often made by interest groups who are an actor who can mobilize the public. So often, or I would say even in general, for a topic to take off in the public debate, you need some kind of actors that mobilize the public. And these actors in trade negotiations, they are often interest groups. And when we talk about interest groups, we mainly mean non-governmental organizations like environmental NGOs, possibly also labor unions that mobilize public opinion on the trade policy issue. And in TTIP, for example, that role was very strong, and the role of NGOs was very strong. Greenpeace, for example, was extremely active in the early stages of the debate in mobilizing the public, in pushing out this kind of frame, one would call, they frame the debate, they frame the discussion about the trade negotiation, and they pushed out all these pictures of the chicken, the supposed chlorine-washed chicken. So this is this famous food processing standard that is allowed in the US, that in order to remove bacteria from the meat, you can actually wash it in a chlorine solution, and that is prohibited in the European Union. And that was such a potent frame that it hugely influenced the European debate. So we didn't talk about the economic gains, the possible gains in terms of gross domestic product that would result from TTIP. We only talked about what does this mean for our food standards, and then other issues came in that were also pushed by interest groups, like the investor-state dispute settlement system that was envisaged in these negotiations. So these were the issues, the frames that were pushed by interest groups, and in pushing those, they definitely had an impact on the TTIP debate, on the politicization of these trade negotiations. So overall, definitely interest groups play a very important role in the process of politicization, but of course only if the precondition is given. I mean, no interest group can politicize a trade agreement between the European Union and Algeria. It's just too low stakes after all.
Okay, and in an article of yours, you explain that interest groups affect public opinion via arguments rather than as source cues. What does that mean, and how did this come into play in the politicization of the TTIP agreement?
Yeah, so what I researched, I was actually influenced by this TTIP example in carrying out this research. So I was actually walking down the street, that's how you get these research ideas, and I saw this ad, this Greenpeace ad on chlorine chicken, and I was wondering, does this really matter? How to what extent does this now influence public opinion? So this was really intellectual curiosity with which I started out, and there were two suspicions or two hunches that one could have. The one hunch is that if an interest group like Greenpeace comes out in opposition to a trade agreement, and you see yourself as somebody who trusts Greenpeace, then the endorsement or the non-endorsement in this case by Greenpeace of this trade agreement could be sufficient to sway your opinion, to make you opposed to the trade agreement. That's akin to lots of studies in the US context that show that if you tell partisans of the Republican Party that the Republican Party endorses a certain piece of legislation, pretty much whatever that could be, they are going to like this kind of legislation, and vice versa. The same happens for the Democrats, of course. So this is kind of partisan reasoning. My favorite party tells me that this is good, so I like it. So this would be the idea of an interest group just serving as a source cue. They endorse something or do not endorse it, and you pick your opinion on the trade agreement in accordance with this position by the interest group. Why would somebody do this? Yeah, because most people just lack the information and also lack the interest to get really involved in understanding what these trade agreements are about. So this was a plausible expectation. And the second expectation that one can have in this situation is that the people are not so much concerned about the endorsement by itself by these interest groups, but by the arguments or the frames that they put forward. So like the chlorine chicken that I mentioned beforehand, they would just be thinking about what do they actually tell me in terms of what kind of information do they give me about the trade agreement, and then I make up my mind in a much more rational way perhaps than in this partisan thinking that I referred to beforehand. And what I did in order to find out what happens here is that I carried out an experiment with respondents in 3 different European countries. And in this experiment, I confronted participants with different interest group names, and they were taking the position that you would expect interest groups to take in favor or opposed to in this case, really TTIP, the trade agreement. And then also using a certain argument, for example, I would tell people, Greenpeace recently came out in opposition to TTIP. They argue that TTIP could lead to a situation in which American companies sue European governments in investor-state dispute settlement courts. And I would then ask them, so what's your opinion about TTIP? And other people would get another message about the German Chamber of Commerce recently endorsed the TTIP because they think that this will lead to an economic growth in Germany or will increase the number of jobs available to Germans. And by comparing across these experimental groups, you can actually calculate out what kind of consequence different messages, the arguments, and different sources like the interest groups can have on public opinion. And what I found is that the arguments were much more important than the names of the groups. So that indicates that there is a certain rational updating taking place in people's minds. So they are quite rational in using the information they get here from in this experiment and using it to make up their mind. But what I also found is that I could actually sway public opinion in either direction and quite strongly so. So I could increase opposition or support for TTIP with just simple one sentence basically telling them. So that shows also how volatile public opinion on such an issue is. And I also found that especially the more emotional arguments, they were particularly strong, and also the negative messages were stronger than the positive ones. So what this tells us about politicization is that, I mean, there are various conclusions to derive from this and that apply to the TTIP case. So first of all, you see a bit of a first mover advantage from all of this, because if you make up your mind, so collecting information, the one that will move first will probably have the strongest effect on your opinion. So now when I'm the first one to tell you, by the way, TTIP is really bad, now you have this in your mind, and that's going to filter, this will make you filter the other information that you get afterwards. It also shows that those opposing such a trade agreement, they generally have an advantage over those that favor the agreement. And especially if you want to frame such an agreement and frame the public debate on such an agreement, you better use negative arguments. They are going to be particularly strong in this case.
Okay, and in another one of your publications, you discussed the International Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, ACTA, and how in the EU, a small group was able to halt its ratification. So how did anti-ACTA interest groups manage to achieve this?
Yeah, that's an interesting case study that actually precedes TTIP, and the article that you are referring to, it was already published at the time when TTIP debate was only just taking off in Europe. So it's quite interesting to see also the parallels then between the ACTA debate and how all of this evolved, how your opposition evolved here, and then later TTIP. So what happened with respect to ACTA is that especially the US administration pushed for negotiations on counterfeiting. So they wanted to strengthen the protection of intellectual property rights at the international level. And they brought together a coalition of the willing, mainly highly developed countries that were willing to agree to new international rules on the protection of intellectual property rights. To a large extent, that wasn't actually seen as a major enterprise anyhow, because I mean, in most developed countries, you have very well protected intellectual property rights. And so at the beginning, hardly anybody really cared about those negotiations. They were opaque, like most international negotiations that are going on at any moment or in time. And there were some NGOs in Europe that took a stance on this agreement early on, but hardly anything happened here. The public didn't really pick up. And as I said, it would even be, in a sense, it's astonishing that you could even frame this very boring issue, because who cares about intellectual property rights, talking in an abstract way, you know? If I come up with intellectual property rights in a course and bore my students, they are going to dislike my course. So that's not something that they're really concerned about. But then the interest groups did exactly that, what I showed for TTIP beforehand. They framed the debate, and suddenly ACTA was about internet censorship. So they are taking away your internet, and they are taking away your privacy on the internet, and this is Big Brother watching you, and so on. And these messages, they really took off, and they managed to influence a large number of people across European countries. And so what was a very small community of people opposing it suddenly became public protests in Poland and Germany. So that's exactly what politicization means. Now suddenly the public at large gets interested in the topic, starts opposing this trade agreement, and the end result was that politicians had always supported it, and everybody, the European Parliament, had just passed resolutions supporting it with overwhelming majorities. And suddenly the European Parliament, when it had to ratify the agreement, decided to vote it down. And suddenly we had an overwhelming majority against the agreement. So you see how things can shift, and starting with just a few people opposing it, but managing to frame it in the right way, putting the right arguments there that influence public opinion. And then that was the death sentence for this agreement.
Okay, and our final question. How has the EU trade policy been impacted by the factors that you've discussed?
Yeah, I mean, the first consequence and the most obvious consequence is that there is no TTIP, and there's not going to be any TTIP ever soon in the future. So there are now attempts at, there are talks about that with the new Biden administration, there could be perhaps some kind of small-scale agreement between the European Union and the US to resolve some open disputes, but nobody even dares to open this can of worms again, because everybody is warned that this is really, really dangerous. Then there are a couple of more specific consequences. So the European Union decided to back away from investor-state dispute settlement in this classical way as it had been done until that. The EU now pushes for an investment court system, in which has it's a kind of permanent court with panels that where the parties to the dispute cannot select their own judges as was done traditionally. There's even an appeals process. So they try to really judicialize this process and move it away from the classic system of investor-state dispute settlement. There is also an institutional change that we have seen, and that means that in the European Union, with respect to European Union trade policy, many agreements signed by the European Union include elements that are exclusive competence of the European Union. So the European Union negotiates on behalf of the member states in the European Union, and the European Union as a whole has the competence to set tariffs, for example, for the European Union, and to decide on services, trade, etc. But there are certain aspects of some parts of investments, etc., that are still national competence. And many trade agreements include these national competences also within what is then called a mixed agreement. So this includes exclusive competence of the EU and shared competence with the member states. And these mixed agreements, they have to be ratified at the national and partly even at the subnational level. And that's this famous Wallonian case with respect to CETA, where one subnational government could block this agreement for some time. And the lesson that has been learned from all of this, that it might be better to separate EU trade agreements into two parts. One that is really exclusive competence, and that can be just ratified at the European Union level, and one part that includes all the shared competence matters that would have to be ratified. But if this fails because of Wallonia, the other part at least that could be ratified. Having said that, so there are these lessons that I would argue other lessons could have and perhaps should have been learned. The issue is that after TTIP, something very important happened in the world trading system, and that is that we saw President Trump taking office in the US, starting trade wars all over the world, and suddenly all the attention moved there, and EU trade policy for the last 4 years has been in crisis mode between US administration that challenged the European Union very strongly on issues, and the rise of China on the other hand that also challenges the European Union. So this is crisis mode now, and all the things that concerned perhaps more transparency and so on, they were pushed a little bit into the background because of these much more important trade conflicts that now dominate the EU trade policy agenda.
Okay, so that ends our interview for today. And again, thank you, Professor Duo, for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thanks to you.